The most professional heist in American history was destroyed by a guy who just wanted to get high. December 1978, Brooklyn. A police patrol spots a black Ford Econoline van parked on a side street. Nothing suspicious, just a standard work van, one of thousands in New York City. The patrolman walks up to it, peeks through the window. Inside, ski masks, several pairs of gloves, and the heavy, lingering stench of marijuana. He runs the plates. The van comes back stolen. They call in the crime scene unit. Forensics dusts for prints. They pull good, clean latents, several sets, clearly left by men who weren't thinking about wearing gloves when they got into the vehicle. Or maybe they thought about it but forgot. Or maybe they were thinking about something else entirely. The prints go into the database, and the database starts spitting out answers. This van wasn't supposed to exist anymore. It was supposed to have been crushed into a cube at a New Jersey junkyard 3 days ago, on the exact same night it was used. That was the order. Clear, unequivocal, leaving absolutely zero room for interpretation. Destroy the van, immediately, right after the job. But the driver of that van decided to stop by his girlfriend's place first. Then he got high. Then he figured the junkyard wasn't going anywhere. Then he forgot. Because of one guy with one joint, at the absolute worst possible moment, the FBI was handed the smoking gun for the largest cash robbery in the history of the United States. On the line, $6 million. Adjusted for inflation today, $25 million. But the true horror of this story isn't about the money, and it isn't about the heist.
The true horror is what happened afterward, when the man responsible for the robbery realized someone had made a mistake and began methodically eliminating anyone who could explain that mistake to the feds. Every single one of them, including the guys he owed a cut to. Today, we're talking about how the perfect crime killed itself and what happened to the men who were in the room when it did. To understand how $6 million ended up sitting in a cargo terminal at JFK Airport, you have to understand one man who had absolutely nothing to do with the mafia, until a certain point. Louis Werner, 40 years old, an airline accountant for Lufthansa at JFK, a man of average means with an average salary and a vastly above-average appetite at the card table.
By 1978, Werner's debt to the kind of people who don't forgive debts sat at around $20,000. 20 grand in 78 was roughly the annual salary of an airport accountant. That wasn't just an abstract number on a ledger. It meant impossible to pay back, dangerous to ignore, no way out. Or rather, there was one way out. The people he owed money to were connected to New York organized crime. Guys like that have a standard menu of options for debtors who can't pay in cash. Information, access, cooperation. Louis Werner chose information. He told them about Room 261.
Room 261 was a high-value cargo vault in the Lufthansa terminal at JFK. Concrete walls, steel doors, security guards, alarms. This vault periodically received special shipments from West Germany, untraceable American currency that German banks were repatriating to the US via Lufthansa. A standard banking operation, nothing exotic, just massive amounts of untraceable cash sitting in one place at one time. Werner knew the schedule. He knew the amounts. He knew exactly when the money was in the vault and for how long. He knew the security protocols, who was on shift, how many guards, how they were armed. An accountant is a guy who has access to information that an intelligence operative would spend months trying to dig up. That information eventually found its way to Jimmy Burke. James Burke, known in certain circles as Jimmy the Gent, was one of the most valuable and one of the most dangerous men associated with the Lucchese crime family in New York. Valuable, because he knew how to orchestrate scores that other guys only talked about in bars. Dangerous, because his approach to people who caused him problems was systematic, permanent, and utterly devoid of sentiment. In his lifetime, Burke was implicated in dozens of murders. The vast majority of his victims were people he knew personally.
This wasn't a coincidence, and it wasn't a pathology. It was a principle. Burke killed the people he knew because only the people you know are worth killing. Strangers don't pose a threat. The threat always comes from inside your own circle. Keep that in mind from the very beginning, because the finale of this story is explained entirely by Burke's character, not by circumstances. Burke evaluated the intel from Warner. Then he evaluated it again. The numbers were staggering. Preliminary chatter suggested there would be about $3 million in untraceable cash in the vault on the right night, plus a separate shipment of high-end jewelry. The actual take would turn out to be double that, but they wouldn't know that until later.
Burke started building a crew. He didn't rush it. He did it methodically, fully aware that every man brought into the operation was a potential point of failure. He handpicked guys he knew personally, whose capabilities and weaknesses he understood. Men he could trust exactly as far as he needed to for this specific job. The crew numbered about a dozen men. Everyone had a highly specific role. Drivers, outer perimeter muscle, the inside men for the terminal. Several guys had direct ties to airport personnel, giving them real-time operational intelligence. They knew the codes, they knew the guards' names, they knew the patrol routes, they knew exactly where the cameras were pointing and what they could see. Prep took months. Burke was in no hurry. Rushing leads to mistakes, and in his line of work, mistakes cost you money, your freedom, or your life. Sometimes all three at once. December 11th, 1978, 3 a.m. A black Ford Econoline van and a couple of trail cars pull up to the Lufthansa cargo terminal at JFK. The security guard at the gate stops the lead vehicle. He is immediately staring down the barrel of a gun. From there, everything moves fast. Men in ski masks breach the terminal. The guards on shift are rounded up, tied, and ordered to lie face down on the floor. No beatings, no unnecessary violence. This is a crucial detail. Burke understood that guards are just working stiffs on the clock, not the enemy. Unnecessary violence means extra charges and extra motivation for the cops. The guards were tied up, politely, professionally.
Next, room 261. The codes Werner provided worked perfectly. The doors swung open. Inside, 40 cardboard boxes, neatly stacked on shelves. The crew started loading the boxes into the van, methodically, without panic, like movers executing a scheduled pickup. 64 minutes. In exactly 64 minutes, they breached the terminal, neutralized the guards, cracked the vault, loaded 40 boxes, and vanished into the night. Not a single shot fired, not a single alarm triggered. The codes were legit. Not a single witness who saw their faces. When the morning shift arrived and found the tied-up guards and the empty shelves in room 261, the tally was staggering. $5.875 million in untraceable cash, plus roughly $150,000 in jewelry. Total haul, $6.025 million.
In 1978, that was the kind of money that didn't just change one man's life. It changed bloodlines. The heist was flawless. Every single element, prep, execution, threat neutralization, had been handled like a military black op. There was only one thing left to do: disappear. Step 1 of the post-op disappearance protocol: destroy the transport. The van used in the job was a rolling piece of evidence, the only physical thread connecting the heist to specific individuals. The van had to disappear into the jaws of a junkyard crusher within hours of the job. Stax Edwards received that order directly from Burke. Parnell Stax Edwards, the getaway driver that night. A guy with a rap sheet of petty crimes, brought into the operation because he knew how to drive and he knew how to keep his mouth shut. Under normal circumstances.
Put yourself in his shoes. It's 4 a.m. You just took part in the greatest heist in American history. You walked away without a scratch. You're guaranteed a cut of a score that just became legendary. The adrenaline is keeping you wide awake. You're alone in the van. You need to drive to a junkyard in New Jersey and stand in the freezing cold while a compactor crushes the van into a cube. Or you could go see your girlfriend.
Stax Edwards went to see his girlfriend. He smoked a joint and he stayed the night. The van was left parked on the street in Brooklyn. By the morning of December 12th, news of the JFK heist was blasting over every radio station in New York. Police cruisers were eyeballing every Ford Econoline van in the 5 boroughs. Maybe Stax decided it was safer to leave the van where it was and not draw attention to himself. Maybe he just stayed on his girlfriend's couch, waiting for the heat to die down. The exact sequence of his thoughts is unknown.
What is known is this. A police patrol found the van 3 days later. They found the ski masks. They found the gloves. They pulled the prints. And they jump-started a machine that Jimmy Burke could no longer stop. When Burke found out about the van, through his own sources inside the NYPD, because he had those kinds of sources, his reaction was the reaction of a man who realizes his masterpiece has been cracked wide open for the stupidest possible reason. Stupidity. Not betrayal, not a professional miscalculation, not some unforeseen force majeure. Just ordinary, garden-variety human stupidity, multiplied by marijuana and the desire to spend the night with a girl instead of driving a van to a scrapyard. Burke thought about it for a few days. Then he made a decision. The decision was pure Jimmy Burke. Systematic, permanent, and utterly devoid of sentiment.
If the prints in the van lead to the guys on the crew, then the guys on the crew become men who have leverage to cut a deal with the feds. And men who have leverage to cut a deal with the feds sooner or later cut that deal, especially when they are staring down prison sentences longer than their natural lifespans. Burke decided the best way to prevent testimony was to eliminate anyone capable of giving it. And here is the detail that changes the entire dynamic. Burke wasn't just silencing witnesses. Burke was eliminating men he owed money to. A living, breathing guy to whom you owe $1 million cut is a guy who will either come looking for his money or tell the cops that you stiffed him. Dead men don't collect, and they don't testify. Burke was solving 2 problems with 1 bullet, erasing witnesses and liquidating his payroll. 1 sweeping action, 0 overhead, 0 loose ends. Starting in December 1978, members of the Lufthansa crew began to disappear, not figuratively, literally. Paul Vario Jr., crew member, body found in an abandoned car. Joe Buddha Manry, crew member, found dead in a parked car. Louis Cafora, crew member, body found in a Brooklyn dumpster. Thomas DeSimone, crew member, disappeared, body never found. Teresa Ferreira, connected to the crew, body parts washed up on the Jersey Shore. Each murder looked like a standalone mob hit, different locations, different methods, different apparent motives. But FBI agents looked at the board and saw one glaring pattern. Every single one of these people was connected to the Lufthansa heist, and every single one of them ended up dead within months of it.
The brutal efficiency of Burke's approach had one fatal flaw. The serial disappearance of a dozen people connected to a single crime is in itself a massive piece of evidence. When 6 out of 10 guys on a crew turn up dead in half a year, that's not a coincidence. That's a flare going up in the night sky. Henry Hill figured this out. Hill was one of the few guys in Burke's orbit who wasn't directly involved in the airport breach, but who knew enough about it. He knew the details. He knew the players, he knew the timeline, he knew about the van and why it didn't get crushed, and he knew about the bodies piling up. And Henry Hill knew how to do math. The calculus was simple. Burke was clipping guys he knew personally, guys he trusted enough to bring in on the biggest score of their lives, guys who knew exactly what Hill knew. Sooner or later, your number comes up. And under Jimmy Burke's management, sooner or later meant a few months, not years.
Hill had one window, a very narrow one, and he jumped through it. In 1980, Hill was busted on an unrelated narcotics charge. The feds offered him a deal. Hill took it. He flipped on Burke, he flipped on Paul Vario, he flipped on the entire Lucchese family. His testimony was exhaustive, specific, and backed up by the kind of granular detail only an insider could provide. Burke was arrested in 1980. At the Lufthansa trial, the feds actually didn't have enough direct evidence to secure a conviction for the heist itself. Too many key witnesses were already dead. But they got Burke on a different charge, a murder connected to a point-shaving scandal, and he was sentenced to 20 years. He died in prison in 1996. Lung cancer. He was 64 years old.
Luis Werner, the accountant who started it all, was arrested relatively quickly. The feds tracked him down through informants. Werner pled guilty to being an accessory. He got 15 years, served a fraction of it, and walked out. He lived the rest of his life in the obscurity of a man who once made a very bad choice at a very bad time. Stax Edwards, the getaway driver, was murdered by Burke's hitmen shortly after the van was found. One abandoned Econoline destroyed a $6 million operation and cost nearly a dozen people their lives. It is, without a doubt, the most expensive screw-up in the history of the American underworld. Henry Hill entered the Witness Protection Program, changed his name, moved away, and co-authored a book about his life.
That book became the basis for Martin Scorsese's Goodfellas, arguably the greatest mob movie ever committed to film. Think about that for a second. A guy who participated in murders, extortion, drug trafficking, and the largest heist in U.S. history lived out the rest of his life as a minor celebrity, gave radio interviews, appeared on television, and died in his own bed in 2012. Burke, who masterminded the perfect heist, died in a cell. Werner, who sold the intel to cover a gambling debt, did hard time. Stax, who just wanted to get high, got a bullet in the back of the head. And now, the money. $6,025,000. Almost $6 million in untraceable cash. Out of that entire haul, the authorities recovered virtually nothing. A few $1,000 found during arrests. Chump change in the grand scheme of the operation.
The lion's share of the money vanished. Burke died in prison without saying a single word about where the cash was hidden. The guys who might have known are dead. There are no ledgers. The money was cash, untraceable, physically existing as paper bills that leave zero digital footprint. $25 million in today's money is sitting somewhere, or nowhere. Because here's what happens to paper cash buried in the ground. Paper doesn't last forever, especially in the dirt, especially for 45 years. If that money was buried in the woods, it physically doesn't exist anymore. It rotted into compost. If it was laundered into legitimate businesses, it dissolved into the economy decades ago. 1970s New York had no shortage of bars, restaurants, and laundromats through which the mob washed dirty bills. But the most likely scenario, it was just spent. Burke was a guy who knew how to spend money with the exact same ruthless efficiency he used to steal it. $6 million, given a certain lifestyle, a certain gambling habit, and the required kickbacks to the mafia hierarchy, doesn't last as long as you'd think. The legend of a massive mob treasure buried somewhere near JFK Airport endures because it's a much better story than the truth. The truth is likely far more prosaic. The money was spent, gambled away, split up, or invested into dive bars that closed down 30 years ago. The FBI kept the Lufthansa file officially open for decades. Every few years, a new lead would surface, an aging mobster cutting a deal, a new theory about where a fraction of the haul was buried. None of them ever led to the cash. JFK Airport today is one of the most heavily surveilled transport hubs on Earth. Room 261, as it existed in 1978, is gone. Different storage systems, different security protocols.
The system learned its lesson. That lesson cost $6 million and a dozen human lives. But the system only absorbed the technical half of the lesson. The human element is much harder to patch. Lufthansa's terminal security wasn't vulnerable because it was poorly designed. It was vulnerable because it was operated by a man drowning in gambling debt, who had no idea how deals end when you make them with men who do not forgive. Luis Werner thought he was trading intel to clear his ledger. He didn't realize that the people he was selling to didn't possess a category for forgiveness. They only had two categories: useful and threat.
Burke understood this. That's why he didn't go looking for hardened gangsters to give him the inside track. He looked for the Werners, ordinary guys backed into a corner with no normal way out. You don't have to threaten guys like that. You just offer them an exit, any exit. They take it, completely blind to the long-term consequences. Because it's hard to think about the long term when you need 20 grand right now. The operation was flawless. It wasn't destroyed by bad planning or poor execution. It was destroyed by the character flaw of one guy on one specific night. One screw-up. One girl. One decision to put off until tomorrow what absolutely had to be done today. And now, the ultimate question. The one investigators never truly answered. Jimmy Burke died in prison without uttering a single syllable about the money. Not to the feds, not to a priest, not to the people who visited him in his final months.
Two options. One, the $6 million physically exists somewhere to this day, and Burke's silence was the final act of control by a man who had everything stripped from him, except one secret. The only power he had left was knowing something they didn't. 2. The money is long gone, spent, betrayed, rotted in the earth. And Burke stayed silent not because he was guarding a treasure, but because admitting the money was gone meant admitting that the perfect heist had ultimately amounted to nothing. Nothing but a life sentence. Nothing but a few obituaries nobody read. Nothing but a Scorsese movie where the hero was the rat who put him away. Which of those two options is the truth? Nobody knows. But one thing is certain.
The most complex operation in the history of the American mob. Months of prep. A 10-man crew of seasoned professionals. Flawless execution. 64 minutes and $6 million in the bag. All of it reduced to zero by one guy who just wanted to get high. If this story hooked you, the next episode is about a case the FBI officially closed as unsolved, even though absolutely everyone knew who pulled the trigger. Subscribe so you don't miss it. See you next time.